So hello, welcome to this installment of Recent Reads. Future Yara here because I forgot to film an intro. Literally everything has gone wrong with me trying to record this video. For one, I've just tried recording it 3 times, but each time I didn't like the way it turned out, and I've just decided to go with this last one because I cannot deal with that anymore. Then as I was recording, the power went out. But yeah, here we are. Here are all the books that I read recently. Instead of chronological, I'm going to kind of go in order of least enjoyed to most enjoyed, even though nothing is really that low. Also, I do this in all my wrap-ups, but I do have the timestamps for all the books I'm going to be talking about in this video, so if you want to skip to a certain book, or if you don't want to hear about a certain book, you can utilize those timestamps to your discretion. And yeah, so enjoy the video. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is More Than Just a Pretty Face by Saeed M. Masood. Now, I read this as an e-arc from NetGalley, but it's actually just released, so you can read it now. This is about a Pakistani Muslim main character named Daniel Jalani, who is a senior in high school and not the brightest student. His real passion lies with cooking, and he wants to be a chef one day, to the disapproval of his parents, who want him to pursue something a little more practical. He ends up being selected to participate in his school's Renaissance Man competition, which is this interdisciplinary academic competition that his school has, and it's very competitive. And the topic that he's assigned is Winston Churchill, which is a bit problematic as he learns more about Churchill's role in the Bengal famine. He kind of enters this dilemma because he wants to talk about the negative aspects of Churchill and what history has kind of slid under the rug, but his parents and his friends just think that he should do whatever it takes to get a good grade and appease his history teacher, who really admires Churchill. So he ends up enlisting the help of a girl named Bisma, who's actually one of his arranged marriage prospects who has her own history that we learn, to help him out with this report and to prove to everyone that he is more than just a pretty face. So I had a wide range of opinions about this one, and to be honest, I'm still not super set on a rating. Overall, I think that the themes that the book explores are really valuable and not something I see too often in YA contemporary, and it showcases a very real issue of colonizers getting to write history and how that negatively affects the peoples who were colonized. And that conflict of doing what is right in your heart versus assimilating to what the popular belief is. And in addition to that overarching theme, I also think there were a lot of really valuable messages regarding the relationships in the book. So on the one hand, we have Daniel's friend group, which was very messy, but I actually really enjoyed the messiness of it. He has had 2 best friends since he was a kid, and as they grew older, one of them started straying away from religion, while the other one started getting closer to it. And that caused a lot of tension and a lot of conflict and argument between them. But I thought it was very realistic to show how people aren't always the same as when you first met them, and that as people change, relationships change. And I liked how the end of the book didn't try to polish everything and make it seem like everything was fixed, but yet there was still that sense of hope that just because relationships change doesn't mean they have to be severed. And then we have the love triangle dynamic, and yes, there's a love triangle. I actually didn't even realize there was a love triangle until after I finished it, because it wasn't a stereotypical love triangle, I guess, like that you weren't supposed to pick a team. Oh shoot, I didn't put my lipstick on. I don't hate love triangles, but if you do, I don't think this would be something that would detract from your enjoyment. I think this is one of the best cases where the love triangle has a purpose and actually helps with the growth of the main character. By exploring different relationship dynamics, the main character was able to discern what was a healthy relationship and how we should be treated. And it helps deconstruct this idea that your first crush or your first love is something that you'll stick with and that will be the best relationship for you, when in reality, it might just be something that you're hoping for in your head. And I really enjoy seeing those themes in books for some reason. All that being said, I did end up giving this book 3 stars, but I was initially thinking I would give it 2 or 2.5 stars, which may seem kind of shocking considering all the positives I just laid out. And it mainly has to do with how much I didn't really enjoy the writing style and the execution of a lot of these elements. It's kind of like if I just blurred my eyes, then all those themes and all those discussions were really great, very powerful, but then once I start looking into the technical elements, I'm like, that could have been done a bit better. Writing style is for the most part a matter of preference, but I did find that the dialogue just didn't flow very well at times. What I could pinpoint for as to why kind of has to do with the lack of tonal or emotional indicators in the writing. Like sometimes I wouldn't realize that something was supposed to be sarcastic or funny because nothing really indicated to me, or at least until later. And so in the moment it felt very disruptive because I was like, whoa, that was a change. I also think a lot of the characterizations fell a little flat. Like, for example, I think the author went a little too heavy-handed on trying to convince us that Daniel wasn't smart. Like from the synopsis, I was under the impression that Daniel was just not very school smart. So it made sense when he wouldn't know like historical events or historical facts. But I thought it was a little bit of a stretch that he wouldn't know words like progress or the phrase break a leg. And also in general, I was kind of uncomfortable with how often they would tell Daniel that he wasn't smart and wouldn't amount to anything. Like, it made me uncomfortable. And a lot of the side characters were also reduced to only a few qualities. And I wouldn't say they were one-dimensional, but they were pretty shallow. Probably my biggest grievance of the book is that there were these random insertions of deep and philosophical moments, a lot of times from characters that we had only met only a few times or barely at all, that were meant to kind of teach the characters something, but it just felt so out of place and took me way out of the story. So yeah, I ended up rounding up to 3 because I do think this is an important story, even though I don't think the execution is as good as I wanted it to be. The next book I'll talk about is Ayesha At Last by Usma Jalaluddin. This is a modern-day Pride and Prejudice retelling featuring 2 Muslim Indian characters in Toronto. We have Ayesha, who is kind of a little stuck in her life. She's working as a substitute teacher right now, even though her real passion is poetry. But she receives a lot of pressure and also some passive aggressiveness from extended family for pursuing a career in her 20s instead of trying to get married, which is compounded by the fact that her younger cousin Hafsa is rejecting hundreds of marriage proposals. And then we have Khalid, who is from a very traditional, very conservative family. And Ayesha and Khalid end up meeting through a mutual friend, and they clash. But this being a Pride and Prejudice retelling, we know that there's going to be a lot of growth and a lot of learning that each person has to do about the other person. So kind of similar to More Than Just a Pretty Face, I had a lot of mixed feelings about this, but this one generally more positive. I had a great time while reading it, that's the first thing I'll say. It is so much fun and is so easy to fly through. Besides Ayesha and Khalid, there's a lot of instances where opposing people or people with opposing values banter, and that banter is just so well done and it's so hilarious. I really enjoyed a lot of the side dynamics. For example, I really liked the relationship between Ayesha and her grandfather, who I believe is kind of like the Mr. Bennet figure. They share this passion of literature and it was really sweet. And also Ayesha with her best friend Clara. A lot of times when books have a best friend figure, they rely on just you accepting that these people have history, that they're close. But I really felt like this book showed how close they were and that they would constantly go to each other for advice and just talk to each other, which I really appreciated. And even the side plot with Khalid and his co-workers, at first I didn't really like it because his co-worker was kind of sleazy, but it went in a direction that I didn't expect and I really enjoyed. So obviously I should talk about the romance, this being a romance. And for the first half, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I thought it was perfectly paced. I forgot to mention that Ayesha and Khalid end up having to do a project together at their local mosque, which is one of the catalysts for them spending time together. And in the beginning, when they both kind of disliked each other and judged the other person, I ate up all the scenes that had them forced to interact. And I love seeing them discover new things about the other person and maybe realize some of their first impressions weren't correct. Sadly, what went wrong in this book for me happened in the second half, or probably last third. There's a lot of drama that goes down, and while it was very entertaining, like I said, I flew through it. It got to a point where it was hard for me to suspend my disbelief. Like, so many things were happening to the point where I felt the plot lost clarity and we lost direction in terms of it didn't feel like we were focusing on Ayesha and Khalid anymore. In general, I think this book also suffered from trying to tackle too many things. I don't want to say too many things in the sense that it's unrealistic that all these things were happening, because people are complex and multifaceted, especially with so many characters going on. There's going to be a lot of complex things and interactions happening. I just think they weren't balanced in a way that made each issue effective. This is kind of hard to explain, but I think that the author tried to deviate from the Pride and Prejudice storyline in some areas, but then tried to go back in other points, but then at that point it didn't feel like it made sense anymore. That's very vague, and the best example I can give is the Wickham storyline. I won't say who it is because I don't want to spoil. The author was trying to make the Wickham character a little bit more sympathetic, but in doing so, almost created 2 different characters for him depending on the situation, which felt a little inconsistent. So yeah, I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. It's probably around a 3, but I enjoyed it so much that I gave it 3.5. There are many Muslim-centered stories in publishing in general, but specifically within the romance genre, as well as one that embraces so much of the Desi culture. And so yeah, I still think it's fun and definitely worth a read. So the next book I'm going to talk about is For Everyone by Jason Reynolds. And this is technically not a book, it was a poem that Jason Reynolds read at the unveiling of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial at Kennedy Center. And I feel like I can't say too much about it because it is so short. The audiobook is like less than 30 minutes. But essentially he talks about what it's like to be a dreamer and how dreams evolve over time and that there's also no time limit for dreams. He talks about his own past and the dreams he used to have, as well as his mom, and how sometimes where you think you're going to end up in a few years is totally different than what ends up happening. And he just kind of emboldens people who are afraid to take those kind of leaps. Like I said, this was very short, but it was very inspiring, especially for someone like me, who I would consider myself a dreamer. INFP. And Jason Reynolds is a very known young adult / middle grade author. So I would definitely check this out if you want to see more of his work or if you want to be introduced to his work. The next book I'll talk about is Little Flowers Everywhere by Celeste Ng. I actually have a whole video dedicated to this, though it is a TV show more centered one. I talk about the book and the TV show. I talked a lot about the changes that they made and the implications that had on the story. So if you want more spoilery centered discussion, that's the video probably I would direct you to. But I figured I would discuss more of my non-spoilery thoughts about the book here. So Little Flowers Everywhere takes place in the first planned community in America called Shaker Heights in Ohio. And it follows this very stereotypical white house and what is the phrase? White house and picket fence? White picket what? It follows a stereotypical picture-perfect family called the Richardsons, and the mom, Elena, is very involved in her community and is very big stickler for rules. One day, a single mom named Mia and her daughter Pearl move into town and end up staying in the duplex that the Richardsons are renting out. And they are the exact opposite kind of family from the Richardsons. They never stay in one place for too long. Mia is an artist and she goes wherever her inspiration is, but they decide that Shaker Heights is where they're gonna stay for the foreseeable future. Because they come from such different worlds and have such different outlooks on life and what a family is, they end up clashing a lot, which has Elena start digging into Mia's past. The whole town becomes stirred in controversy when the Richardsons' family friends try to adopt a Chinese baby, and Mia and Elena find themselves on opposite sides of that issue. So there's not too much of a direct plot in Little Fires Everywhere. A lot of it is just things happening in the town, and we see how Mia and Elena, as well as all the kids, react to things. So I think the strongest point about Little Fires Everywhere is how much social commentary it has and how interesting that commentary is. Motherhood plays a huge role in the story, and specifically how characters define what good or bad motherhood is. And even as readers, it's kind of hard to discern sometimes because there are so many different factors going on. And a lot of those factors have to do with privilege, which I think this book explored really excellently. The novel really highlights disparities in class and how that affects the choices we have when faced with difficult situations. The one thing I really wish this book had done better was the ending. It just felt very flat to me and underwhelming, considering everything that was built up throughout the whole story. And especially with the kids' storyline, like with the Richardsons' 4 kids and Pearl, all of their dynamics, I really enjoyed seeing them throughout the book. I thought they were so interesting. I thought those were just like left behind without any solid conclusion. And perhaps that was intentional to not give you that kind of catharsis for a reader, but I didn't enjoy it. Yeah, in terms of the technical stuff, I thought the writing was really great. It was very straightforward, though with a tad bit of lyricism sprinkled in there. It flowed very well, and even when we were in these flashback scenes, I didn't feel like the story was just stopping. It was always intriguing, and I always wanted to continue and learn more. Perhaps my favorite part of the book as a whole was its subtlety and the way that it approached all of these topics, because a lot of times when you have issues of class or race, they're not always overtly offensive. A lot of times an accumulation of microaggressions or smaller acts that do a lot of harm. And I thought that exploration was done wonderfully. And I gave this 4 stars. You can tell how dark it's getting based on how reflective the lights are. So the next books I'm going to talk about are the first 3 books in the Pandava Quintet, which is Arusha and the End of Time, Arusha and the Song of Death, and Arusha and the Tree of Wishes. So I read these in June. They were our June picks for the Rick Riordan Presents Read Along. And they were so delightful. If you missed it, we actually did a live show interview with Roshni Chakshi, and that's on Julia's channel at A Reader's World. It's also spoiler-free, so you don't have to worry if you haven't read the series yet. And Roshni is such a cool and funny person, so I highly recommend checking that out. So the series follows Ayesha, who has a very bad tendency to lie. She goes to a very affluent school with a lot of rich kids, and her mom is the curator for the Museum of Indian Art and Culture, so she doesn't get those same luxuries as everyone else. One day some of her classmates come to the museum, and in an attempt to not be caught in one of her lies, Aru ends up lighting the cursed lamp of Bharata, accidentally releasing an age-old demon called Sleeper, who was set on awakening the god of destruction. This leads her to discover that she is one of the reincarnations of the Pandava brothers, who were heroes from the Mahabharata, and she has to find the other reincarnations in order to save the world. So the series infuses a lot of Indian and Hindu mythology, and at first it's kind of a learning curve because there is just so much to learn, but there is a glossary, and I also think that Roshni Chokshi explained things in a very accessible way. Most of my pros for this series actually have to do with the characters. I mean, I'm a very character-driven reader, but I think with middle grade especially, a lot of it depends on exploring the characters' struggles and their goals and their motivations, as well as having very distinct voices. And that was very much true for this series. This is written in third person, but you still got a lot of Aru's voice in there, and she is just so funny. She has this awkwardness that was very relatable to me when I was her age, and honestly, still now. And there were a lot of pop culture references to things like Lord of the Rings or Disney, and sometimes I don't really like pop culture references, but it felt very organic in the story, and just fit perfectly with Aru's personality. What I really appreciate is that there was so much depth to the characters, and even when they had these humorous or quirky qualities, there was always that layer underneath that showcased more about what they've been through, what their experiences have been to make them that way. So for example, Aru's habit of lying. So it's very realistic just for any kid to do that, but it also doesn't just stop there. It's a way for us to look at Aru's psyche and how she deals with difficult situations and how she develops the defense mechanisms. And that's true for all the characters that we meet. They have a lot of different experiences and histories that they have to kind of work through, whether that be abandonment issues, insecurities, having parents go through divorce, having parents be deported. They don't take up the entire narrative, but they're there enough to give you that depth that I really loved. And that's definitely my biggest pro for this series, is how well the humor is balanced with the serious topics and the serious discussions. I also want to mention that I'm really enjoying the way that the villains are developed in this series. Obviously, I don't want to say too much, but it's a really good example of how you create a sympathetic villain and a really interesting internal conflict for the main characters. I also want to highlight that Roshni Chokshi is so good at creating exciting endings. Like all three books, whenever I was like, I wonder, like, is this going somewhere? You're hit with this huge climax that is so exciting and so action-packed. So I gave the first two, The End of Time and The Song of Death, 4 stars. My only real con is that I think the plot meandered a little bit in the middle, but I gave the third book 5 stars. And my camera ran out of battery, so the end of the video was cut off. But I think you got the gist of what I was trying to say. Please let me know your thoughts on any of these books, if you've read them, if you want to read them, heard things about them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.